kind of resources would you be applying to do this kind of work? What's the agenda? How are we going to take that agenda forward? I detected a level of shallowness and a lack of interest in really creating the kind of change that I think many of us know is needed. And it was the first time I observed that there was a little bit of a leadership crisis in American healthcare. Like, there's the things we say, there's the things we do, there's the gap. Great leaders acknowledge the gap, and others normalize the gap.
Hello, and welcome to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. I'm your host, Lee Scheinbart, and this podcast brings you the hottest and most crucial conversations in healthcare and physician leadership today. As most of the listeners know, we are dedicated to understanding what it is like to get into physician leadership positions, and we've spoken with a number of folks on the front lines of adversarial national politics, labor disputes, measles outbreaks, hospital closures, and many other circumstances. And I do want to pause and recognize what is happening in Kirk County, Texas, where the local communities have just experienced a devastating once-in-a-100-year flood. Having participated in several local and regional disaster events in my career, I want to acknowledge all of the first responders and volunteers involved in the rescue and recovery efforts in the communities impacted by the flooding. I also want to extend prayers to those who have lost loved ones. One of my deeply held opinions, and one proven to be true time and time again of late, is that when things go badly, there is no cavalry coming to the rescue. There is only you and your fellow community members who care deeply enough to save one another. Today's special guest, Dr. Sachin Jain, is no exception to this observation. Dr. Jain is one of those unique individuals who takes his obligations seriously wherever he finds himself, attempting to lead and make changes and contributions to the people in his community. Dr. Jain, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Lee. Great to be with you. You can call me
Thank
Sachin,
you.
please. Yeah.
Sachin,
Yes.
will do. In a moment, I will share with our listeners a bit of your background and why I was so keen on hosting you on the show. But I wonder if you want to talk about where you grew up for just a moment, which, as I recall, is Bergen County, New Jersey, an area devastated by Hurricane Superstorm Sandy in 2012. And you were the CMIIO at Merck in Boston.
That's true. It's true. It's true.
And
Yeah.
you were seeing patients at the VA and at the Brigham, but I imagine you have family and friends that were impacted in Jersey. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, people's homes were flooded and people experienced tons of damage. Fortunately, no one in my immediate sphere was impacted or injured. But what I will tell you is, everything you said about what's happening in Texas really, rings true. Here in California, where I now reside, we've just been navigating the fires both in the Pacific Palisades as well as Altadena, and we've had thousands of people in the community impacted, a number of our health plan members, a number of our patients, and a number of our staff members. So it's very humbling to lead people through these experiences. And to your point, it really is what we do ourselves that makes a difference in these moments of turmoil.
Yeah, well stated. It has been very difficult in Southern California. So I hear what you're talking about. Well, let's go back a bit in time before you were at Merck and begin with your time at Harvard, where you earned your undergraduate degree in government and later earned both your medical degree and MBA, correct?
Yes. So when I went off to college, my dad gave me two options. He said you could either be a doctor or you could be a physician. Ultimately I chose physician. It sounded more professional. But there was an implicit expectation. My father was a physician who came to this country in the 70s, hoping to get advanced training and go back to India. Like a lot of people, he came here and started to build a life, and one thing led to another. And my brothers and I, found ourselves growing up in Bergen County, New Jersey. We came from a culture that kind of knew two professions, to be really candid with you. It was like engineering or medicine were kind of the things to do. And so anytime I came home with an idea that didn't fit into that box, my parents did say, you could be a lawyer, and, you could be a lawyer and a doctor. And so there was just a lot of implicit expectation. When I went to Harvard, I really wanted to make the profession my own. And I think also from my father, I had a strong interest in public issues. One of our favorite pastimes was actually watching the evening news together. And I at the time I kind of got interested in this idea of health policy, and got exposed to a number of really amazing mentors at Harvard. Probably the most significant of which was Don Berwick, who I think, as you know, was leading the creation of the National Healthcare Quality Movement at the time, and was just launching the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. And so, I got to work with some of the real exciting people in the field, and it helped crystallize a vision for me of a career where I might be a practicing physician who also worked on public policy issues at a broader scale. When I got deeper into health policy, I realized that it moves very slowly in this country. More recently, it's moved a lot faster. But I would say, uh, you know, we'd waited years and years and years, decades for any kind of fundamental reform. And so I thought that if I really wanted to change healthcare, maybe working at the helm of healthcare organizations might be a way to do that more effectively and at least have more impact. And so I ended up getting my MBA in between my third and fourth year of medical school. And then when I actually finished my residency, I was in this very weird, bespoke program where I was half-time resident at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in internal medicine, and then half-time was, a fellow or junior faculty at Harvard Business School. Then this crazy thing happened, which is, Obama was elected president. Health reform was the center of his domestic policy agenda. So I went down to Washington to work with David Blumenthal, who was the national coordinator for health IT, helped him with the implementation of the HITECH Act for a year, and then spent another year with my old college professor, Don Berwick, working on the launch of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation. So that was my kind of career, leading up to the time that I became the CMIIO, the first and only CMIIO of Merck.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's this is a fantastic background, and some of our listeners do know the IHI and Don Berwick, and you were very fortunate to be in that sphere. But for some of our younger listeners, what I'm picking up on and what I'm trying to impart is, if you do want to make transformational change, then set your sights on being at the helm of an organization where change can occur. And to your point, in government, it may go a little bit more slowly than you might desire. If your DNA is an emergency medicine physician, that might give you a lot of heartburn. As an oncologist, it takes me 6 months to see the tumor shrink on CT. So I have a little bit more patience. The OB has 9 months. So we're all wired a little bit differently, but I do believe in what you say. And that is probably the key reason that I asked you to be on the show. You wrote on LinkedIn, and I picked up on it immediately, and I'm going to quote it. And that's why I asked you to get on the show. And you are a prolific writer, no doubt about that. But you said, how do we change the paradigm to recenter the importance of clinical informed voices in executive leadership and healthcare? And that's when I reached out to you and you agreed to be on the show. We're going to come back to that question in a little bit. But let's do a little bit more into your history and how you've evolved into the role and thinking about this. So after Merck, and you began to gravitate to that payer side of healthcare, what were you thinking relative to why that side of the equation, if you can share that with us?
Well, Lee, if I can rewind the tape a little bit, I did my time in government, then went back to finish my residency, and then I resumed the path that I thought I was going to be on, which is I thought I was going to work on health system transformation, either in Boston or New York, and talk to the CEOs of all the institutions that exist in those cities, big academic medical centers, community hospital systems. And I quickly had the sinking realization, that lots of these organizations don't actually want to transform. They see the problems clearly, but on some level, these are successful organizations despite the presence of those problems. And I was offered interesting roles, medical director for innovation, chief innovation officer. When I started to have the second level conversation where I said, what kind of resources would you be applying to do this kind of work? What's the agenda? How are we going to take that agenda forward, I detected a level of shallowness and a lack of interest in really creating the kind of change that I think many of us know is needed. And it was the first time I observed that there was a little bit of a leadership crisis in American healthcare. Like there's the things we say, there's the things we do, there's the gap. Great leaders acknowledge the gap, and others normalize the gap. So I had a crisis of confidence in my own career path. I thought that the academic health system world was going to be where I spent my life and my time. And then it didn't feel like that anymore. And at around the time that I was talking to those health system CEOs, I got a call from somebody I met when I was working in the Obama administration saying, would you be interested in consulting with Merck on, the creation of a new role, which was this chief medical information innovation officer position. And, in this funny Dick Cheney way, as I helped them work through a few candidates, they turned to me and said, why don't you do it? And so I then, interviewed with, the whole ELT at Merck at the time, interviewed with Ken Frazier, who's, the legendary CEO of that organization. And they meant business. They were interested in going deep on digital health. They were thinking about beyond the pill. They were thinking about real world data, innovative partnerships. So I made the leap over to Merck. And then 3 years into my time at Merck, I got a phone call from a health system or a healthcare organization that really wanted to create the kind of change that the folks in Boston and New York didn't want to do, which was Lebo Lesson at CareMore Health. And so that kind of pulled me out of biopharma and pulled me into managed care and innovative care delivery, the place I wanted to be all along.
Can we stay in that time capsule for just another moment?
Sure. Yeah, of
Okay.
course. Of course.
So you're talking to leaders in Boston and New York, and you're beginning to question what it is you're doing, and that these organizations knew their problem set, but were not initiating those transformative moves that were important to you, right? It just directionally, these CEOs, were they physicians and clinicians or non-clinicians,
Many of them were
generically?
physicians. Many of them were physicians. I mean, academic health centers oftentimes have physician executives, physician CEOs, but they, were highly successful, oftentimes operating on the wrong chassis. So, we were at the time nationally talking about the move from fee for service to value based care. Trying to really integrate a vision of population health into organizations. And again, I would say the thinking was rather superficial. It was more like check the box. We got to be doing these things. But in terms of how they were going to be doing them, how well they were going to be resourcing them, how central they were a part of the strategy of these organizations, it was more the tasty side dish than the main course.
So this is helpful for leadership development as I think about the students in my classes, and I'm sure you've given this some thought. It helps to at some point create that true north, have a vision, and then discern, are you in the right space? And look, to be fair, the academic medical centers, they play a very important role in how you and I and others practice medicine and utilize what they're uncovering and how they're teaching and how people are learning. And maybe some of them may never be situated to change. I think with the current governmental policy moves, we are going to see some movement as a consequence of how funding will flow. That's an entirely different conversation. But so to be fair, some of them are not set up to move. They're set up to do other, they have another role to fill. But if you as a leader say, I want to be a dean of this austere institution and never change, go for it. Be that person. But if you want to make change, you probably need to find that organization that will change with you. Does that make sense?
Yes, 100%. And look, with hindsight, with the benefit of hindsight, I can say, yeah, I mean, these are organizations that are outstanding at doing the thing that they were doing, and when you are outstanding at doing the thing that you're doing, you kind of want to keep doing it, right?
Right,
But
right.
again, I think so that is the tension for somebody who wants to be a change leader is like if you have to work with incumbents who are proud of their existing models, then you might end up banging your head against a wall trying to actually create change. because they're successful in a business model that you may or may not believe in, right? And so again, I think that's where choosing your tribe, choosing your organization, thinking beyond the academic health centers, because I think we all get socialized to them too. You kind of fall in love with the places you train at. I certainly did. And my dream when I was a med student was to be the CEO of the Brigham and Women's Hospital. I love that institute. I still love that institution. I mean, it's just amazing. I feel chills when I walk into it. It's a place that is full of amazing memories for me. But to your point, that place is maybe built to do something different than the thing that I wanted to do.
Yeah, yeah, and I think what is a shift in our career, and I'm thinking about all the way down to the medical students. We have white coat ceremony coming up next week. There's a different mindset to the next generation, and that there's good and bad to all of our different generational cohorts. But whereas there was that unwillingness to shift in the past, there's a tremendous willingness amongst the younger folk to collaborate, and they have a grander social vision. And there's so many startups that are attempting to shift that whole. So if the house of medicine is like a cruise ship and it goes 1 degree to the left, a couple 100,000 miles later, you're in a wildly different place. And I think we're seeing these shifts occur in places that didn't occur when you and I were in training. And our attending said, well, when I was at the Brigham, well, you still are, sir. So, and, but now people have had multiple stages to their career. They have a startup mentality. They want to move that degree, that trajectory. And I'm encouraging our young listeners to think about how they can be transformative and be more intentional. A lot of my mentors were tapped on the shoulder. You're a good guy. You know your medicine. You seem to teach well. We want you to lead. And they're never really given the critical teaching about leadership, intentionality, vision, strategy, and then it helps set forward that inertia that never changes, right? So
100%. And again, I will always remember, like a mentoring conversation that I had with someone at an academic health center that I trained at. And he said, "You're just too ambitious. In your 30s you should want to lead small groups. In your 40s you should want to maybe start to lead larger group. In your 50s maybe you could have a shot at running an institution." And my first CEO job was I was 35 years old, and I think it wasn't exactly the kind of organization that I thought I was going to lead, but we, in other industries, we honor youth and we honor energy. In medicine, we honor gray hair or no hair, as it may be, and that's kind of how it ends up. So I think, one thing that you said that is making me think a little bit is, are today's medical students really different than the ones that we went to medical school with, right? And I bet you they are. And one of the reasons they're probably different is something, referring back to what I said earlier, is like, I think if you wanted to be successful in the 70s or 80s, like if you wanted to be a successful person, um, there were a couple of professions. And I think, medicine is no longer the alpha profession in terms of like financial success. You do this because you want to do this. And I think that makes a huge difference. And so I think the character of the profession is likely going to change in good ways, because we're probably now attracting young people who are maybe more in it for the so-called right reasons. The right reasons being like the work and uh, the patient care and uh, a desire to really drive change in healthcare.
I agree, and it's still early and anecdotal, but the students that I interact with that come to me with questions relative to the house of medicine and things like that, they do have this desire for social change. Things like equity, fairness. They are as smart, if not smarter, than when you and I were selected to matriculate. So it's not an IQ thing. It's not a technical thing. There's something else that maybe is still a little ill-defined. and they've grown up in a very different world, and so they'll have a different view. And I'm excited for their future. Let's talk about SCAN a little bit. Our audience may not yet know. You are 5 years this week is your anniversary at SCAN,
It is.
the Senior Care Action Network. You wrote about this. I read what you wrote. It is a, if not the largest not-for-profit Medicare Advantage health insurance provider based in California, over 300,000 members, as I recall,
You got
spread
it.
out
You got
over
it.
the desert Southwest. What perhaps the thing that you are most proud of in the last 5 years at SCAN?
Well, I think if I could give you two, one is I
Two.
think we've grown, right? We've grown our membership base, our revenue base, and our geographic footprint. So our membership has gone from 219,000 to about 306,000. Our geographic footprint has expanded from California to Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas. We've expanded the products from our traditional products to additional products that are focused on specialized populations, women, LGBTQ plus populations, as well as an Asian focused health plan. And then I would say the second piece of it is really diversification, and the real signature program in our diversification efforts is our medical group focused on people experiencing homelessness. I got really inspired around homeless medical care when I was in college, actually. And, we now operate one of the largest medical groups focused on treating people experiencing homelessness. Last year, we saw 6,000 unique patients. We saw 3,500 with 5 encounters each minimum.
Wow.
So I think we've really gotten closer to vulnerable populations. That's always been a part of our mission and our mandate. But I think now we are like closer to the patients and closer to the work in a lot of ways.
That look, give me 20 more like that. That was fantastic, and congratulations
Thank
on
you.
that work. That is transformative. People tend not to think about those efforts about affecting populations and communities. And again, it goes back to the opening observation. There's no magic, spaceship coming down to fix that homelessness medical care problem. It's up to local people to decide, can we do this? Should we do this? Will we do this? Let's do this and make that impact.
Well, it's a problem. It was frankly in Southern California where we live. It was an epidemic in plain sight, and it was something that is very abnormal that we've normalized. We've literally blocks and blocks and blocks of people living on the streets, experiencing homelessness. A number of those folks wandering into suburban communities, and we just kind of said, oh well, it's just part of life in LA. It's not part of that life in LA. It shouldn't be part of life in LA. We're a rich country, and we should find ways to really support these people better. And I feel really really proud of the work that our team has done along those lines.
That's wonderful. And one of those individuals walks into the emergency department, and because they've not been cared for and have undiagnosed issues, it can grind the ED to a halt. And so it isn't good for the healthcare system either. Not just how you live in LA. So
Not to mention, the fact that maybe that person has, a wound infection that then turns into sepsis, that then turns into an ICU stay, and at a cost of hundreds of thousands of dollars to government payers. There are probably better models of serving this population than having them use emergency departments for primary care that over the long run can actually save money for society. And so I think that there's a real business case for bringing medicine to the streets, and that's what we've set out to prove here at SCAN.
yeah, I was going to ask you a question that I've asked former physicians to folks in the White House, including Barack Obama and folks heading the VA and folks in Congress, whether or not you, as my guest, have had conflicts with your oath and obligation as a physician to the role that you are, whether it's at SCAN or at Merck. And in this case, I was asking folks in other roles. But I don't even want to ask that question because it feels like you have aligned your physician role with your leadership role and to care for people using the health plan as a vehicle and all of the parts and pieces. I don't know if you want to comment
I think
on those thoughts.
one of the things you see physicians do when they enter into corporate roles is some of them actually quickly shed their physician identity. They engage in what I call code switching. They, basically go from a physician code to a business person's code. And we like to pretend that the two can be the same, and the two are not the same. And on the margins, we can make decisions that are, potentially anti-patient. And you're not going to always be pro-patient in a business role. It's a bit Pollyanna to say that, because there are limits to what you can do with the financial resources that you have. But there are oftentimes situations where you have to make trade-offs. I'll tell you about one that we made at a prior company where there's this question of like, should we put copays on insulin? Everyone else in the industry was putting copays on insulin. Copays were initially intended to drive rational utilization of services. There's no irrational use of insulin. And so, it's one of my proudest moments is actually, it was my CFO, Mike Plum at the time, who's a really amazing guy who thinks who's the one, CFO in America who may think like a physician. He's like, we don't want people not using insulin. That's bad for them. It's probably bad for us from a business case perspective, because if people are not taking their insulin, they will end up with longer term complications that are going to cost us more money as a health plan and as a medical group at the time. And that kind of thinking is very rare in healthcare. There's very few people pausing to ask that question. And that's where I think physician leaders, to your point, have a unique capability to really bring clinical insight to business questions. And it's sorely needed. It's really sorely needed.
I love that example, and it brings back some PTSD where I was in charge of our cancer service, and two of the medical directors of our health plan came to me and wanted to talk to me about erythropoietin, which was brand new at the time, EPO for those of you. So, and we're having a very casual lunch, and I said, "Why are you requesting all of this paperwork when I want to order 40,000 units of EPO?" And they quite and they're both physicians. Oh, it's our stop sign. I said, pardon me? It's a stop sign because we know if we put up the stop sign, more often than not, cars will stop in traffic when there's a stop sign. And I said, but my patients benefit from this product. Yeah, that's what you think, right? And so then, all of a sudden we're in two different universes and this code switching. I thought I was talking to two friendly physicians, and they were looking at rationing a product because it was very expensive, and I'm thinking of it from a clinical perspective. So insulin
So
is
interestingly, EPO's a good one to kind of, if we can spend a minute on this one, this is a good one to kind of pull out and have a little bit of a longer conversation.
let's do it.
As an oncologist, 100%. But I think you probably also remember for CKD patients, there was almost overutilization and overprescribing of EPO. And so I think some of what ends up happening is like the UM paradigms that may work in UM, for those who are less familiar with this language, utilization management paradigms that may exist in some clinical domains creep into other clinical domains. And again, this is where being a really good doctor ends up being most important, which is like, hey, for the oncology patients, we don't want to the EPO. But for the CKD patients, where the clinical evidence suggests that there are limits to the amount of benefit that EPO can actually give you, and in fact, you stretch over into harm subsequently. And again, I'm reading the book Empire of Pain. Are you familiar with this book at all?
No, sir.
So it's about the Sacklers, who are the family
Oh,
behind Purdue Pharma. And I didn't know all the history here, but they had a huge career in medical advertising. They actually created the pharmaceutical advertising industry before they got into Purdue Pharma. And there is a long history of business forces, and I didn't fully appreciate the history here, like doctors being co-opted to be agents for driving overutilization of products in situations where they weren't. And so there's this interesting tension of like, why do we have this Well, the reason we have this is because some physicians abandon their clinical mindset, ethics, and duties to then go over to like, let's sell as much product as we can. And so it creates this funny situation now where you as an oncologist need this product and don't have it to be able to give to your patient.
Well. Okay, we need another minute on this, and we may have to come back and meet again. So think about the structural dynamics about prescribing insulin to your patient versus the oncologist recommending EPO. The fundamental difference for most people back in the day is that I bought the EPO. I kept it in the fridge. I administered it with the help of my staff. And at the time, there was no auto pen or self injection. And as a result of that structure, there was a margin, there was a profit, there was a rebate. It was insane. And I know it still exists today, but that's not the point. But it goes back to your comments about what you reviewed with the Sacklers and the industry. The industry incentivized me knowingly or unknowingly. So now I had a double incentive. One, it was for the patient benefit. Number two, it was lucrative to the practice. And it became harder and harder, as you're pointing out, to separate that. As opposed to when I order insulin, there's no benefit to me in theory if the patient is getting it through a mail order or going to the regular pharmacy to get it. So in fact, if you and I were to go back in time, what I would say is we should not store this product. This should be available like insulin. And if you're a CKD, if you're a chronic kidney patient and you know you can tolerate a hemoglobin of 9.5 or 10, and they don't need to transfuse you on dialysis, why spend the 20 extra bucks or whatever your co-share is to even inject yourself? It would have changed the entire dynamic of that product and its utilization. What do you think?
100%. I think everything you're saying is gospel, right? And so, and so, amen. I think the issue that we really face, though, is there are many slippery slopes.
Yeah,
The EPO slope is a slippery slope. The physician payment for infusion and injection and storage, it's a slippery slope, and it creates the incentive misalignment where oftentimes doing the right thing for yourself isn't the right thing for the patient.
right,
And
right.
and again, I don't think I think most physicians don't say that out loud to themselves even
Uh,
because because we're looking for evidence that the thing that's good for us is also good for the patient, and we can oftentimes find it because we're oftentimes pelted with evidence that says conflicting things sometimes even.
And when I was in medical school, I might have had maybe 30 or 60 minutes of health system science or health system structure because you went through the track that you went through and you worked with Don Berwick and all of that. You had a much broader exposure to all of that. Most medical students in the 80s and 90s did not. There was no health system science at the time. So back to the point, our young students are being exposed to this. And instead of having that silent thought, they're more likely to have a small group and go, really? We're going to make decisions and money based on these products as opposed to ordering the right care for the patient. So that's a good thing. I want to go back to code switching for a second, and whether physicians are afraid to speak out loud or compartmentalize these thoughts about the decisions, whether at their practice level or the CEO level. Once upon a time, you used a phrase that has been attributed to you, our digital phenotype relative to what? How does code switching and our digital phenotype, what are those things?
So the digital phenotype was used to it was a riff off of um, some of the concepts in evolutionary biology around how phenotypes get expressed, and what John Brownstein and I wrote in our paper, introducing the concept of a digital phenotype, is the idea that we're increasingly leaving a digital footprint that is connected to our experience of disease, um, that may leave digital breadcrumbs, so to speak, uh, as it relates to mental conditions, behavioral health conditions, metabolic conditions that may influence both diagnosis and treatment. So if you go back to here's a really simple example. One of the stigmata of bipolar disorder is like hypergraphia, writing a lot. And so then the question becomes like, could you detect undetected um, bipolar disorder by reviewing someone's Facebook posts and seeing if somebody is 2 or 3 SDs, above the mean in terms of their writing, and use, their writing to identify, conditions, and then maybe even over time use it to actually change the management of those conditions or track the management of those conditions. And again, it kind of aligns with the digital health, landscape, the wearables, because we're giving out signals, digital signals to the world that end up being markers of disease potentially. And so that's kind of the concept behind the digital phenotype.
That is so. I never heard that. I think that's an amazing set of insight. But where my head was going, and we'll test this together, is if I'm a CEO or a physician executive and I keep repeating myself, and now there's a digital record of the things I say, and then that in turn influences the actions that I take. So we'll talk about these two fellas that are talking to me about EPO, and I practiced with them before they became medical directors. One was a surgeon,
Wow.
one was an infectious
Wow.
disease doctor,
Wow.
and so now that was a little back in the day, pre-digital, but imagine if they're on a podcast such as this. Everything you and I say is now in the public record, and it's going to live for a very long time. And it will then reinforce my own behavior, not as a diagnostic tool. And maybe I do have diseases that you can discern later. But the point being, Lee, you said it and you said it again and you kept saying it. And you now have a digital phenotype and expression that you are now locking yourself into about how you think about physician leadership.
Yeah.
That's not what you're teaching and it's not what you're preaching, but it's out there in the digital form.
Yeah, and I think about that as more being a digital avatar of you, right? Yeah, yeah.
I
So,
don't want that.
yeah, the idea that, if you enter into ChatGPT, what does Lee Scheinbart have to say about X, Y, and Z, and it can probably get into your brain more than you can actually get in there yourself sometimes. I think that's a whole other thing, and that's probably more what you're referring to. No, our use of the term digital phenotype was much more about patient expression. If you're somebody who does 10,000 steps a day, and then you're suddenly doing 2,000 steps a day, and it gets recorded on your Fitbit, does that tell us that maybe you're at risk for a CHF exacerbation at that moment in time? When we triangulate your clinical data with your the digital breadcrumbs that you're leaving behind.
I love it.
Um,
I
yeah,
think there's something there.
yeah,
We'll leave that to the next generation. So, two topics I want to hit before we wrap it up, and
sure,
one of those is that initial key question about the paradigm of clinical voices. So, hold that thought. I read something that you had written in JAMA, which I thought was really insightful about. On the views of Julian Legrand, the British economist, who stated that public policy is grounded in a conception of people as knights, knaves, or pawns, and that it would be important that policymakers, leaders of, like in your position, really think about these three buckets, these categories of people, and use that conceptually in the way they lead organizations. But you also warn physicians should think very carefully about how they are contributing. And this goes back to my vision of the
yes.
digital phenotype. The public perceives you in a certain way, and the way you behave might give a phenotype of a knight or a knave or a pawn. And I'm curious if you've given this thought about the
Oh yeah.
public
So
perception.
listen, so I've worked in pharma, I've worked in managed care, I've worked as a practicing clinician, I've worked in government, and no one in any one of those industries says I'm a knave. Right?
Right.
No one ever says that. But some of the behaviors, regardless of the sector, are knavish. And the truth is, and I'm an optimist in this way, most people, are probably either knights or pawns. They're either benign or they have really good positive intent. Um, but the knavish element of every profession um, ends up, really influencing how the rest of everyone is viewed. And I think when we do come up with health policy, when CMS right now is talking about their major focus is going to be on fraud, waste, and abuse. Um, that makes my heart sink a little bit because like what they're doing is they're taking the 5% of our profession who are looking for the loopholes and exploiting everything that they can exploit for their own personal benefit. And then they use that to kind of regulate the whole industry. What it does is it creates unnecessary burden on people who are actually behaving in a knightly way. And so, and that over time, what we know is when you treat knights like they are knaves, they actually become knaves. And so I really think, from a public policy perspective, from a management perspective, it's so important to think about how do we actually make sure we're treating knights as knights, knaves as knaves, and pawns as pawns. um, and we're doing the work to discern. I think about the word discernment a lot. Like, what is this kind of person? And forget this podcast and forget like the profession for a second. Like in life, our moments of greatest disappointment are when we think someone's good or has good intention or aligned intention and they don't. We misjudge. And again, I think the work of leaders in healthcare is to really get very good at the discernment and think about policies that treat the subsegments the right way. And that gets to the question of utilization management, something we spent a lot of time on in this podcast is, for people who order things the right way, for Lee Scheinbart, who orders EPO in only the right situation, you shouldn't have a stop sign.
Right.
Um, but if
Right.
there's somebody who's just kind of giving it out like candy and to the wrong people, let's put a stop sign in place for those people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and
There's
again,
there's a
yeah,
growing movement, and I like this idea from the payer side. You can get a gold card if your outcomes are great and you're using it, and we all agree you're using it appropriately. You get the gold card. I'm not going to ask you to fill out paperwork, have your nurse call my nurse, and so on and
yeah,
so forth. But if your utilization is off the charts, two standard divs, like yeah, we're going to call a timeout every 30 days
yeah.
and review your work. And
Yeah.
I don't know why we wouldn't do that.
Yeah, the interesting thing, Lee, is we've been talking about gold carding in managed care for decades. And now, you know, people say it's coming. Have you gotten a gold card from anyone
No.
yet? No.
No.
So, I mean, this is the part that drives me mad and
Yeah, yeah,
where a lot of my kind of passion comes from is like it's so easy to talk about this stuff. It's harder to do, and very few people are actually doing the things. And
yeah,
it's
yeah,
that's what drives me a little bit crazy.
yeah, yeah. Well, we're gonna get to that crazy because I know you have a vision, and I'm gonna digress one more moment before we do that. So, in leadership, we do teach in our programs to hold things loosely, to be open and curious, and try not to put everybody in that box of that that discernment principle that you're talking about. Because if you walk in the room with a narration in your head of that person already is a knave, the whole thing is over before it started. And so you walk in loosely. Again, I don't know how well you prescribed X, Y, or Z. I'm not going to assume you are a bad utilizer of anything. Let's look at how that practice is unfolding. What is that pattern? And then discern what we're going to do about it. And that requires that ambiguity of holding things loosely. That's a leadership skill. That is not a technical thing about too much money or too much prescribing. That's just leadership looking at it curiously, openly, and with good intent. Yeah. All right. Here's the question that we're going to wrap up with. So we've talked a lot about the ecosystems of healthcare and how to align oneself in a way that we are all practicing good medicine, whether at the bedside or all the way at the top of the organization. You have declared that you would like to see more clinical voices in executive leadership. How do you think that should unfold? What are the thoughts and mechanisms by which we get there?
So Lee, I know that this is a podcast, focused on chief medical officers. And what I will say is the following is if you want to be a CEO, don't be a CMO. Interestingly, and I think what you need to do is be a business person who speaks like a doctor and a doctor who speaks like a business person. And I think you have to kind of get really good at that sort of synthesis. One of the most frequently asked questions I get is like, should you go to business school? And I say, like, look, business school is just like the first 2 years of medical school. You're learning a language, but you're not necessarily learning how to animate that language, which is what you do in your third and fourth year of medical school. So I think you have to kind of, get into some uncomfortable positions where you're doing things that you didn't know you were going to do. I think one of the biggest obstacles to physician leadership is the physician tendency to play it safe. We're writ large, if I can give a stereotype, a play it safe group. You didn't go to medical school because you wanted to found Google.
Oh no, we are risk averse, brother. You are
Right.
preaching to the
And
choir.
and so like you got to take some risks. And I don't even think about myself as that risk avid, but relative to some of the people I went to training with, I picked up and left a Harvard academic medical environment and went to a managed care company no one in Boston had ever heard of. Those are the kinds of things you got to do, is take some chances, be prepared to fail. And we didn't talk about this, but I've had failure at every stage of my career. It's part of the game here.
Yeah, and we're beaten into submission when we go pre-med, med training to not do that. And so it is, talk about code switching, that is really hard to do. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I've never heard these phrases before, and I feel very enlightened by this show. Any last comments you want to make to our
No,
listeners?
thanks, Lee. This was awesome. I do a reasonable number of podcasts. I'll say this is one of the best that I've done, and really enjoyed the conversation. So thank you so much.
Yeah, same here. This is in our top 10 list for sure. It's been amazing. And for all of you listeners, this is the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer, as Sachin just told us. And if you want to become a CMO, check out our website, thefirechiefcmo.com. Sign up with us. I love connecting with physician leaders and CMOs from all over the United States. So sign up on our website, check us out, share the show with your colleagues. And in the words of Sergeant Phil Esterhaus, let's be careful out there.